At Home in North Branch by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 12. Lorenzo Helps Again. When Gladys finally subsided, Sarah Jane and I grinned at each other and walked to the window to watch for the men. Sarah Jane spotted them first.
"Here they come, I think. When that man gets the black washed off, I'll be able to tell if it's Thomas or not." "It's not right to be suspicious," Len said as I got breakfast for us, "when I don't know any of the facts, but I didn't see either Cy or Roland Brewer at all. I hope they haven't left town."
"You do know some of the facts," I reminded him. "You know that a theft was planned. It wouldn't be illogical to assume that someone had started a fire to cover his tracks, would it?"
"I suppose not, but it wouldn't be fair to say who had done it. A tramp going through on the train could have tossed a match or a cigar into the yard. I suppose even a cinder from the engine could have started it."
"But you don't think so?"
"No, I guess I don't," Len replied unhappily. "There will be sad days ahead for North Branch while they're getting to the bottom of it."
"Poor Jerome," I said. "This is going to be a loss to him." Suddenly, I remembered that the bank had been one of the buildings destroyed. "Oh, Len, will there be any money left in town? What happens if everyone's savings were burned?"
"Mr. Curtis is hoping that he won't have to face that possibility," Len replied. "The vault seemed to be intact. As soon as it cools, he'll open it." He grinned ruefully as he attacked his breakfast. "This is one family that doesn't have to be concerned over that. Our riches aren't stored in a bank vault." He laid down his fork as another thought struck him. "There won't be any shingles for the church. I'm sure Jerome will plan to rebuild, but it could take months to get back into production." Len suddenly looked tired and discouraged. I hurried to put my arms around him.
"The Lord has another plan for that roof," I said. "He won't leave us without a place to worship. There are other shingle mills north of us. I'm sure the men will go up and get them when the time comes. Our members will raise the money for it."
I'm so weary that every problem seems like a major obstacle right now. Things will look better after I've rested. I'm going to get cleaned up and go see Jerome.
He turned at the doorway.
"You don't look much better than I feel. If there aren't any children at school, come back home."
The morning air was filled with fine black ash and the acrid odor of smoldering wood. Once again, I was surprised to see all 16 children arrive at school. They were an exhausted bunch, but the excitement of the night before ruled out any possibility that they would have slept had they stayed at home. They were eager to talk about the occurrence that was undoubtedly the most eventful of their young lives.
"Pa was the first one at the mill last night," Joel announced, "and I was right behind him. We hauled up all the water we could from the Burton's well, but it didn't help much." "What did your pa do when he saw the fire?" Edward asked Daisy. "Did you go with him?"
Daisy Brewer looked down at her desk, and her face turned red. "Papa didn't hear the bells," she said. "We didn't know until this morning."
Stares of amazement were directed toward Daisy. "Didn't hear them? I reckon every dinner bell in North Branch was clanging," Teddy exclaimed. "I reckon they heard clear over in Edenville."
I was about to interpose when Toby Elliott spoke up.
"Aw, that's terrible. You missed all the fun. I mean, excitement. You never saw as much stuff burn at one time. The roof of the saloon just went poof."
He threw his arms up into the air to illustrate his point.
"Yeah, and did you hear the bottles popping in there?" Teddy said. "Ma said there was no great loss without some small gain, but I don't know what she meant."
Daniel said that he had accompanied his father to the scene and had helped carry things out of the hotel lobby.
"One man threw his slippers out the hotel window and then came running downstairs in his bare feet and his nightshirt. All he had with him was a blanket," he reported with disgust. "I would have at least grabbed my clothes."
"You don't know what you might do," I told him. "You can be panic-stricken when something like that happens to you. I'm sure that the man felt fortunate to get out alive."
Daniel nodded. "That's what Pa said, too. He thanked God this morning that only things made of wood were destroyed. They can be replaced, but people can't."
To my dismay, Julianne Lawton burst into tears and put her head down on her desk.
I went to her and took her in my arms as the other children sat in stunned silence.
Julianne, what is it? What's the matter?
Nancy responded for her.
Pa never came home last night.
Her chin began to quiver.
Ma thinks he might have been at the mill. Elizabeth says she ain't seen him since day before yesterday. We don't know where he is.
Tears ran down Nancy's face and Ruthie Lawton started to howl. Hannah had the presence of mind to take Ruthie on her lap, and the twins and Mary Ann comforted Nancy with pats on the back.
We'll pray that your father is all right,
I said.
Perhaps he had business to take care of out of town, and he'll be back soon.
Julianne looked at me gratefully, and I realized that in spite of the trial that she had been to me in the past, she was still a child in need of love and sympathy. As the oldest daughter still living at home, she felt the weight of the responsibility for her worn-out mother and a father she couldn't depend on. I dreaded the day that the news would come out that Cy had been partly responsible for this tragedy, if indeed he had. The fact that he had disappeared made the possibility more apparent. When a semblance of order had been restored, I proposed that the children make a newspaper to chronicle the events of the previous night. Each one would write an article describing what he or she had seen and how they felt about it. The 3 little ones could provide pictures. We would bind the pages together and keep the paper in our room as a remembrance. They took to the idea enthusiastically, and everyone was soon busily engaged in setting down his own eyewitness account of the disaster. I eagerly awaited Len's return later that afternoon. He had gone with Jerome and Roland to inspect the area that had been the shingle mill.
Does Brewer know what may have started the fire?
I asked. No idea. Everything was fine when he locked up and left, according to him. He says he's willing to cooperate in an investigation.
Cooperate? I'd say he'd better have some answers if you ask me. Does he know where Cy Lawton is now?
Hasn't seen him for 2 days, Len replied. The big question for Jerome to sort out is whether the two were working together as Lorenzo's story indicates, or whether the fire was an accident that upset their plans.
There is insurance, isn't there?
Yes, but it won't be available until there's been an investigation and a hearing. Jerome won't be able to handle it because the property belonged to him. The insurance lawyers will conduct the hearing, but you can believe that Jerome will do some digging on his own into the cause.
I imagine he'll talk to Elizabeth,
I said.
I hope she'll tell what she knows, but she is so frightened of her father. Do you think she would testify against him, or even against Roland Brewer for that matter?
I don't know, Len answered. I tried to find her today, but her mother said she had gone away. Agnes says she has no idea where, and I believe her. She's terribly upset, especially since she knows Cy's habit of running away from any trouble he's caused. The workmen are quite sure that he wasn't at the mill when it burned. No one has seen him since the day before. Gladys was loud in her denunciation of the Lawtons.
I'll tell you what I think,
she said to anyone who would listen.
Mr. Brewer took my advice and went right back to his office and fired Elizabeth. Then her and her pa came back at night and set fire to the place. Why else would they both be gone?
This was a difficult argument to refute, much as I didn't want to believe it. I hoped Elizabeth would soon appear and tell what she could about the whole affair.
I think I'll hear from the other girls if Elizabeth comes home, I said to Len. I don't believe there's much that goes on there that doesn't get to school.
The investigation of the fire turned up very little that was not already known. The townspeople were willing to put the blame on the invisible Lawtons. If they were not guilty, why weren't they here? But Jerome was not ready to give up the search for proof that Roland Brewer was involved. I think my best move would be to find Cy Lawton, he said. It would be easier if Lorenzo had learned where they intended to meet. Jerome didn't have to wait long for information. He and Len were talking in his office when Lorenzo Hardy again paid them a visit. On paper, he carefully recounted the events of the night of the fire. When it was time for Lorenzo to go home that afternoon, Len and Mr. Brewer were still out in the mill. Lorenzo debated whether to wait for them to come back or leave the closing up to the manager, and finally decided to go home. But later he felt uneasy and wondered if he ought not to check on the building. Quietly, he let himself out of the house and made his way to the mill. All seemed to be in order, and he was relieved to find that doors were locked securely.
He was about to leave when a shadow at the edge of the woods caught his attention. He couldn't be positive from such a distance, but he thought it was Mr. Brewer. Lorenzo knew that it was unusual for anyone to be lurking around the fringes of the property at this time of night. Mr. Grayson should be aware of it, but by the time Lorenzo could alert him, the person would be gone. He decided instead to follow the man. Staying far enough back so as not to be detected, Lorenzo kept his quarry in sight. It disturbed him not to know whether the ice and snow crackled under his feet, but since the man didn't turn around, Lorenzo assumed that it did not. They reached a clearing rather abruptly, and the man stopped and looked back. Lorenzo had just enough time to duck behind a tree, but he could see that it was indeed Mr. Brewer. Lorenzo stood still and watched while Mr. Brewer entered a cabin after kicking the door open. The only light was from the moon, but it was bright, and he dared not cross the clearing to look in the window. His hands and feet were numb with cold, but he was determined to wait and see if Cy Lawton came out with Mr. Brewer. He stood for what seemed like a very long time. He couldn't hear the bells clanging in North Branch, but when Lorenzo stamped around in that direction in an attempt to warm his feet, he saw the light from the fire. His first thought was to run toward town, but a glance back at the shack revealed Mr. Brewer coming out and closing the door. He would have to follow him or risk being seen. Fearfully, he waited until Roland was far enough ahead to make it safe, then stayed behind him all the way to town. The fire had been worse than he had supposed, and Lorenzo immediately began to work, helping to carry furniture out of the burning hotel. As he worked, he thought to himself that Mr. Brewer could not have been responsible for the fire since he, Lorenzo, had seen him several miles away at the time it started. He didn't know what Roland had been doing in the shack, but Brewer had been in there much longer than it was necessary just to look around. Lorenzo determined to tell Mr. Grayson all that he had seen and let him sort it out. Jerome was grateful. "I won't forget your help," he wrote to Lorenzo. "You have been a good employee. We will look into the matter right away." Lorenzo beamed happily at the praise and left Jerome and Len to talk the situation over. Jerome was not unfamiliar with the shack and the clearing, and he would go out the next morning and look around. Meanwhile, his presence was needed in town to help assess losses and work with businessmen.